Hi, allow me to start with a story. This story is about Steve, a man crazy about the Raiders, works in construction, and has 3 kids. On the surface, he seems like any other average American dad. However, Steve has just celebrated his 10-year anniversary of sobriety. After a successful experience in AA, he not only overcame his addiction to alcohol and various other substances, but also found a meaningful way to contribute to his community by helping others recover from addiction. This transformation was the result of an organization that introduced him to God and directed him to Christ. Not too long after starting AA, he started attending a local non-denominational church and really came to love the Bible. The pastor's beautifully articulated biblical exegesis helped encourage Steve's understanding of the word, and as his passion for the church and Christ grew, he began to study the history of the church more and more. And as he dove deeper and deeper into the earliest days of the church, Steve found he really enjoyed learning about the early martyrs, people like Justin Martyr and Polycarp, and found that their passion for Christ in some way resembled his own. He liked the stories of Ignatius of Antioch and Irenaeus, but there was one little sort of annoying thing that kept plaguing his mind. They all seemed to put a lot of emphasis on the church instead of a direct relationship with God. He kept talking about bishops, priests, leaders, and to make matters worse, they talked about the bread and wine like they weren't symbols, but actually the body and blood of Christ. And they seemed to believe that baptism actually did something. So for Steve, he had heard previously that Catholics believed that the bread and wine was actually the body and blood of Christ from a fellow inmate at the local county jail where he spent some time in after getting arrested for a DUI. And it turns out that the other inmate who had grown up Catholic, but hadn't really been a good Catholic for most of his life, was kind of taking the opportunity of incarceration to reconnect with the faith of his youth. At the time, Steve thought, this Catholic dude's interpretation is pretty crazy. And he dismissed it outright because clearly the bread wafer thing that the Catholics were eating at Mass still looked like, a very wafery piece of carbohydrate. And the wine still looked very much like fermented grape juice and didn't seem to have that bitter iron flavor of actual blood. But then one day, Steve reads John 6 and read Christ's command to not just eat of his flesh, but to chew on it. It hadn't really occurred to him that the early church fathers' position and the Catholic position actually sort of had this biblical basis. So Steve began to wonder, could there actually be something to it? Surely not, he had doubted. For Steve had encountered too many other addicts and people sporting Our Lady of Guadalupe tattoos to fall for the Catholic cult. But just to be sure, he decided, hey, I'm going to go check out a local Catholic church and see what Catholics actually believe. And if, perhaps there could be a relationship between what they say and what the early church fathers he was reading about say. Only there was just one problem, and it was this. There wasn't a local Catholic church in Steve's community. It turns out that in his town of 10,000 people, if you were Catholic, you needed to drive 2.5 hours away to the closest big enough town, where there would be a small mission parish. And, all that Steve had around him were non-denominational, Presbyterian, LDS, Methodist churches, but nothing Catholic and nothing Orthodox, which, as Steve learned, was the only other group to believe that the bread and wine were the actual body and blood of Christ. Now, while Steve is a work of fiction, the truth is that there are thousands of veritable people living all over the world who find themselves in a similar situation. They want to investigate Catholic and perhaps Orthodox truth claims by actually talking to a priest or someone at one of those churches who is knowledgeable enough to answer their questions. But sadly, they don't know how to access such a person. Right now, as I am speaking, we can all safely assume that there are people out there who want to learn more about the sacraments and the good news of the gospel as maintained by the magisterium and the deposit of faith. But sadly, only can begin to do so either by making great sacrifices to travel great physical distances or navigating through the perilous jungle that is the content available on the internet about the Catholic Church. So, what is to be done for these persons? Before continuing, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Jordan Ring-Sakabe. I am a Catholic artist. Since the summer of 2023, I've dedicated my life and profession to creating works of art for Christ and the building up of his kingdom here on earth. One day, it's my dream to paint murals and large-scale paintings for cathedrals, basilicas, churches, whatever. I want to do sacred art. Right now, I'm sort of content to continue in my divine doodles. I'm a dabbler of divine doodles. Kidding. Behind me here is a portrait that I'm currently working on of Saint Mary of Bethany. Please pray for us. You can check it out and my other paintings out at Ring-Sakabe I'll put a link in the description along with, this painting. You'll be able to see some of my other work there if that's your thing. If not, that's cool. But I want to bring up the fact of me being an artist because I want to set up what I'm about to present sort of in that same spirit that I believe G.K. Chesterton wrote his masterpiece Orthodoxy, which, as I see it, is this kind of a thing. In other words, I don't presume to have an exhaustive knowledge on what I'm wanting to talk about and investigate here with you. So any argument and criticism that one might levy against me or my credentials, my morality or sanity or whatever, right? Like I readily accept, that sort of a thing. I might even agree with most of it. And I'm not trying to nonchalantly, make a vain declaration of, sinnerhood here. But would like to just sincerely recognize, my weaknesses, but also assert that, while I am an artist, and while I'm, I might not have a theology degree or, I might not have studied the sociology of the church for as long as other people. I do think that my experience is such that I can offer a unique perspective on this issue. And so while as an artist, I might be prone to being excessively sentimental and idealistic, and I might be subject to overly subjective perspectives of reality. What I'm really hoping to do is evoke some of that, just a new, fresh perspective on this discussion that I've sort of had glimpses into within the Catholic Church. So, yeah, let's just dive straight into it because, one thing that I've noticed as a convert to the Catholic Church is, and that I've heard a lot about, is that there's a decline in access to the church and to priests, and that, we have this increasingly secularizing society whose values continue to contradict, Catholic and Christian teaching. Those aren't different things; those are the same thing. Christian teaching, and often we try to externalize those issues, like, oh yeah, people, the laity is changing, and the church's problems are because of society. But there's a lot of stuff that we can also examine internally, right? And I think that some of the things we're experiencing right now are the result of an internal entanglement of ecclesiastical conventions. So, in other words, the policies surrounding the priesthood may seem to be defined initially by inscrutable dogmas and doctrines, but some aspects, right, like of the priesthood, are the result of useful, prudent, and faithful traditions. So, during the 12th century, at the Second Lateran Council in 1139, and then reaffirmed at the Council of Trent in the 16th century, the practice of mandatory celibacy for priests was formalized as part of a broader effort to reform clerical discipline and prevent abuses such as nepotism and the inheritance of church property. Additionally, it enabled priests to have, this kind of undivided attention where their celibacy made it so that they could be wholly devoted to their pastoral duties, and the service of the church without the additional responsibilities and distractions of kids and family and other domestic concerns. Um, Additionally, celibate priests, were more. It was easier to reassign them to different parishes or missions as needed, and this enhanced the church's ability to respond to the various needs of its community. And we could just go on and on and on about in a litany of the practical, spiritual, and scriptural reasons that form the basis of the convention of celibacy in the priesthood. And I'm in no ways in endeavoring to convince anyone that we should get rid of the celibacy in the priesthood. However, I am hoping to encourage further discussion and debate on the need for a mandate of celibacy in the Latin Rite of the church, and am hoping to present a convincing case for also allowing men who are already married the option of becoming a priest in the Latin Rite of the Catholic Church. So, as a convert to this church, one aspect that deeply attracted me was its traditional nature and the centuries of refinement in not only the architectural beauty of its buildings, but also in its teachings and preaching, impressed me profoundly. I developed a deep appreciation for the Catholic Church's respect for tradition. However, traditions that have lasted for thousands of years will inevitably include practices that were initially designed to address a specific issue in a specific historical context, but may over time lose some of its practicality. For example, this is, from the UK. There was this thing called the Red Flag Law, and it was enacted in the 19th century. And its purpose was to regulate early automobiles, which shared roads with horse-drawn carriages. This law required that a person walk ahead of a car waving a red flag or carrying a lantern to warn approaching horse-drawn carriages and pedestrians of their presence and to ensure everyone's safety. However, as the 20th century progressed and cars became more and more common, these laws were gradually repealed and fell into disuse. Or rather, they fell into disuse. Today, you would be hard-pressed to find anyone in London on the streets waving a red flag in front of a car as, they cruised on by, or, holding a lantern. Society and its traditions have changed. And while this metaphor might seem exaggerated, I think it effectively illustrates that even within, a context like the church, practices that do not pertain to dogma or doctrine should be regularly, R words, right? No, I'm just kidding. They're fine. Those practices that do not pertain to dogma or doctrine ought to be regularly reviewed and updated if necessary. This ensures that outdated mandates not become obstacles between Christ's salvific grace, facilitated through sacraments. It doesn't become there's not an obstacle between that and then those people who are seeking it. Just as the individual with the red flag once served a purpose for maintaining safety on the roads, later, that person being there, a street full of cars, that's almost like a dangerous hindrance, right? And at a certain point, it became a danger. Similarly, in the church, I'm wondering if there could be, or the practice of celibacy specifically, may need to be reevaluated and adjusted to maintain relevance and efficacy. Training wheels are essential for a toddler learning to ride a bicycle, but would prevent a skilled cyclist from winning the Tour de France. In both cases, regular reassessment is crucial to support growth and progress. Now, I anticipate that many people will hear me discussing marriage and the priesthood and immediately dismiss my thoughts because it would be unimaginable for them to ever consider letting their parish priest subject themselves to the pleasures and pains of matrimony. But such a simple dismissal fails to appreciate the nuance of the position that I'm actually trying to present, and it's different than that. I do not desire, this reductionist view that we should just immediately greenlight all priests everywhere to take upon themselves wives and children. Rather, I'm much more interested in and envision a parish kind of like this one. I'm going to call this the parish of John. Now, who is John? Well, John, as he was aptly named, is a parishioner at St. John's Catholic Church here in our small town. Me and you, this is our town. John, the programmer, not to be confused with the evangelist or the Baptist, experienced the blessings of a fruitful career and is now enjoying early retirement. You see, John got married in his 30s after earning a doctorate in computer science. He helped pioneer asynchronous functionality in his, programming language of choice and was able to create a platform for other developers to sell their applications on. He continues to receive a percentage of each sale made on that platform that he laid the foundation for. So in terms of money, he's good. One day, after an appointment with his doctor, John discovered that it was his infertility and not his wife's that was the cause of the lack of children in their large 4-bedroom condo, that they had downtown. However, that curse also proved to be a kind of blessing in that it allowed John and his wife to amass a considerable savings for themselves, and they got to easily travel around in Europe, at which time John was particularly impressed by his experiences in Rome. You see, he had heard, but he had never actually had the opportunity to behold the beauty of St. Peter's Basilica. And now, back in the States, he found himself attending RCIA at St. Patrick's. He then moved out of the big city and now loves his small parish community at St. John's, but finds himself at 40 years old, married, super on fire for the Lord, interested in the priesthood, but unable to join it. And not because of a dogma or a doctrine, but more of, the result of a council and canon law. Now, who is John really? Is John really real? Yes. But his name may not always be John, because John exists in every man who, by the nature of his upbringing and access to information, was unaware of the veracity of the Catholic Church. John exists in every person whose heart was in the right place, but perhaps bodily wasn't born in the right place. And by, born in the right or wrong place, I mean a place that held no access to the truthfulness of Christ's gospel dispersed through the deposit of faith. So, to be fair, John does not exist in all those deprived of access to the gospel as disseminated through the deposit of faith and the magisterium, but rather in a subset of those men who also possess, let's say, the intellect of St. Irenaeus, or the steadfastness of Simon Peter, or the fraternal friendliness of St. Francis. In other words, John exists wherever there's a man who discerns a vocation to the priesthood, but due to circumstances and canon law, is forced to express his devotion elsewhere. I expect many who object to this view to protest by saying such an individual ought to content themselves as, something like a Knight of Columbus or an extraordinary minister or in the diaconate. And to such a person, I would say, yes, those things, they are truly a blessing that our church has, provided for us. And it's awesome to have so many great and wonderful means, institution and modes for expressing devotion. However, in the same way that the church has historically employed a rational basis for creating a mandate for priestly celibacy, it carries an equal capacity for one day rationally determining a need for adjusting the policy. So, it is completely imaginable that one day there is a council formed where this mandate for celibacy is lifted. Additionally, are you aware of the fact that the Catholic Church already has married priests? Before I became Catholic, I was under the impression that all priests had to be celibate. So when I encountered priests of the Eastern Rite in our church, in other words, usually married men who happened to also be priests, who were in full communion with, the Latin-Rite of the Catholic Church, I was stunned. And one reason for my surprise was because one objection I had to wrestle with before entering the church was this. I had conflated the sexual abuse scandal within the church with the mandate for celibacy in the priesthood. And so, I had believed that the repression priests experienced due to their vows of celibacy was the single largest contributor to the problem of sexual abuse within the Catholic Church. So, you know, one day when I'm, listening to Matt Fradd on Pints with Aquinas point out that in some rites of the church, married men can become priests, I was stunned. I thought cool, but I also felt confused, because what does it mean to state that we already have married priests within the Catholic Church? Well, it means that we already have one of our first sort of hurdles in this regard resolved for us. In other words, is it possible for a priest even to become for a married person to even become a priest? And the answer is an obvious and resounding yes. This is true not only in the majority of non-Latin rites of the Catholic Church, but also in the earliest examples of the church that we can point to historically. People involved in apologetics, I think, will be familiar with the following argument and proof text. So, I ask for their patience. But here we go. A read through of the first book in the New Testament reveals that some of the original 12 apostles were married. The most well-known example is the Apostle Peter. The Gospel of Matthew states that when Jesus came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she got up and began to wait on him. And for reference, that's Matthew 8:14 through 15. And while there's less direct evidence about the marital status of the other apostles, it was not uncommon for Jewish men of that time, including those who would later become Jesus' disciples, to be married. And while the Protestant apologist may attempt to use information like this as proof against the form of the priesthood that is represented in the Roman Catholic Rite, as me, a devoted Catholic, I'd say. This fact, or the fact that this passage indicates that Peter was married, since having a mother-in-law typically means you're married, it doesn't somehow prove an erroneous view of priestly celibacy for the Protestant, but it is merely indicative of the fact that within the history of the church, it's somewhat of a false dichotomy to say that either we have celibate priests or no priests at all. Now, of course, the policies within the Latin Rite take a large amount of inspiration from the writings of the saint and apostle Paul, who in his letter suggests that, he was unmarried and even recommends singleness for all those who can accept it for the sake of undivided devotion and devotion to the Lord. So this comes from 1 Corinthians 7 through 8, as well as verses 32 through 35 in 1 Corinthians 7. And I mention this just because, I'm in no way attempting to deny the advantages and blessings granted to those whose singleness enables them to serve the Lord in a truly unique and focused manner, right? But rather, the point I'm trying to make and the change that, I'm hoping to see is that, I think it would be great to return to a first century hybrid model of the priesthood, which grants a man like St. Peter to continue as a married man and St. Paul to continue as a celibate. In other words, this is not part of some liberal agenda to make the church more left-wing or, considering the lifetime and the age of the Catholic Church. If anything, this is more of a conservative and traditional view. It is also possible to address the concerns that were being solved by the mandate of celibacy in the priesthood using other means and methods available to us in the modern age. So, for example, advancements in technology have significantly enhanced the ability to prevent abuses such as nepotism, inheritance of church property, and family ties, and a lack of clerical discipline within the church. Digital record keeping, online databases, and sophisticated auditing software help to ensure transparent and accountable management of church assets, reducing the risk of unauthorized inheritance or misappropriation. Additionally, communication technologies and social media platforms enable real-time reporting and monitoring of clerical activities if that's necessary. They they can help foster a culture of transparency and accountability. I'm not saying that, like everyone needs to, get on TikTok or anything like that, but, there are like tools out there that help to solve the same problems that we look to celibacy to solve. And again, this isn't intended to be a replacement for celibacy. These tools allow for a more rigorous enforcement of ethical standards and disciplinary measures, making making it so that any misconduct can be swiftly addressed. Consequently, celibacy can still be maintained as a valuable option for those who choose it, but it need not be made mandatory necessarily for the priesthood. The enhanced oversight and accountability provided by modern technologies create an environment where married clergy can serve effectively and responsibly without the risks traditionally associated with nepotism and mismanagement. Also, this approach respects the diverse callings of individuals while upholding the integrity and discipline of the priests of the church. While some might argue that married men who want to become priests should affiliate with the Eastern rites that already allow for married clergy, this solution, I think, is impractical for most. The 23 non-Latin autonomous rites make up only 2% of the entire Catholic population, meaning approximately 1.27 billion Catholics belong to the Roman Rite. Most devout Catholics have never attended an Eastern Rite church and might not know where to find one. This geographical and cultural disconnect makes it difficult for married men to manage the logistics of family life while also seeking out a remote Eastern Rite church for seminary education and ordination. On top of that, there are the difficult politics of maintaining an Eastern Rite church within a predominantly Latin-Rite diocese. Eastern Rite communities sometimes faced resistance from Latin-Rite bishops and clergy. So, yes, some of these bishops and clergy historically have viewed Eastern Rite practices as creating disunity or complications within the diocese. And as an example of this, the Catholic News Agency on August 24th, 2006, published an article that reported on a global conference of the Syro-Malabar Church, where delegates reported on how their communities were struggling to gain permission to celebrate their liturgies in their native language, as well as build actual physical churches. These issues often stem from a lack of understanding, or acceptance of Eastern Rite traditions by Latin Rite authorities. And furthermore, those Eastern Rite priests who minister in Latin Rite dioceses frequently need to learn complex new rituals and immerse themselves in the spiritual traditions of the Latin Rite, which can be a significant undertaking, compounded by the fact that Eastern Rite seminaries generally have more exposure to Latin theology and spirituality during their training than the Latin Rite counterparts do. So there's sort of an asymmetry that happens there, and that asymmetry can make it even more challenging for a married individual who, might have started out in the Latin Rite but wants to become a priest and subsequently is, pursuing, the priesthood through the Eastern Rite. So some might argue that the massive presence of the Latin Rite, despite the absence of married priests, proves that celibacy in the priesthood has worked well so far. And I think that this is a pretty interesting argument. And I don't have like a perfect answer to this, but this is what, I'm thinking, right? So to address that whole concern of if it isn't broken, why fix it? Well, my intention is not to fix something that I perceive as broken, but rather I'm imagining this as opening a door that I think is closed, and it doesn't have to be. So like I said before, like I've said a dozen times, I do not wish to eliminate celibacy from the Latin Rite, but I think there's a way to provide an additional pathway for married men who feel called to the priesthood, and allowing it as an option within the Roman Rite. So the church can enable those discerning a vocation to the priesthood without forcing them to switch rites or seek ordination in some other holy order within the church. So finally, like in addressing the pragmatic concerns many people have regarding married men becoming priests, I think it is essential to recognize that many of these issues have already found resolutions within the rights of our Eastern Catholic brothers and sisters, right? So a lot of the sort of arguments against having married men become priests is because they'll point to how family life and parental responsibilities present too many hindrances. Um, and it seems that for a long time, for literally thousands of years, our friends in the Eastern Orthodox churches and in those rites that have then come into communion with the Roman Rite have largely found ways to deal with those conflicts. And so what I think we need to do is, we don't need to worry about reinventing the will when it comes to managing the practical aspects of priestly duties and responsibilities. Rather, we can study and learn from the experiences of the Eastern rites and Eastern Orthodox churches and can apply their successful practices to our context on an as needed basis or as it applies sort of basis. And if a parish finds that, one single priest perhaps is unable to manage all of his responsibilities, then perhaps newly ordained married priests can be trained to specialize in specific roles. Like maybe they're able to and trained in all the functions and in all the responsibilities, but in terms of boots on the ground, actual work, one priest could help share a specific task in the workload. So maybe he focuses on celebrating daily mass while another priest hears confessions. Maybe one priest with a background in therapy could provide the sacraments of healing and reconciliation, while another with maybe a background in financial expertise could manage the parish finances. Or maybe you have a man who previously had a career that involved public speaking, and he could serve as a good homilist, delivering inspiring and impactful sermons. I'm not here trying, to perfectly, determine and distinguish how it should be applied, but rather start a conversation that could then spread into various places, and then individual people locally could discern, with their diocese, with the guidance of their bishop, just how exactly a parish's responsibilities ought to be divided up. By ordaining a variety of men with diverse specialties who discern a vocation to the priesthood and happen to be married, I think the parish can benefit from a broader range of skills and experiences. This division of responsibilities can be overseen and moderated, like I said before, by the bishop of the diocese. And admittedly, not only am I not attempting to determine how to best divide the workload, nor how to determine the optimal number of priests for a parish, but I think clearly there should be somewhat of a vetting process. Perhaps it is okay for a man who happens to be married to become a priest, but maybe it needs to be a man whose children have all grown up and moved outside the house. Or maybe it needs to be a person who, like in the example I came up with, like a person who experienced infertility, right? And was never able to have children. Regardless, I think the discussion is good. And perhaps the only reason why married men continue to not be able to enter into the priesthood is because there has yet to be a concerted effort to articulate a manner in which dogma and doctrine and tradition are respected and upheld, in that Christ's salvific work is not hindered, or it doesn't create a stumbling block for certain individuals. By approaching this topic with sincere and charitable consideration, I'm hoping and praying that we can, help support our church leaders and help our priests and bishops bear one another's burdens, as Christ admonishes us in Galatians 6:2, to bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. In summary, maintaining celibacy as an option, but not as a necessity in the Latin-Rite for priests, could harmonize the church's ancient traditions with the pastoral needs of the modern world, ensuring that the church continues to grow and thrive in a changing global landscape. Moreover, the benefits of such a change would be manifold. It would acknowledge the historical understanding of the diverse ways in which the Holy Spirit has called and still calls individuals to serve, allowing the church to draw from a wider pool of potential priests, thus addressing the issue of declining vocations. And this kind of more inclusive approach respects the tradition of celibacy while also recognizing the legitimate calling of married men that we already experience in the Eastern rites, thereby enriching the church's pastoral ministry and strengthening its community life. So, in this video, I've attempted to address the issue of already married laymen joining the priesthood, not already ordained priests getting married, by focusing on the possibility of married men considering a vocation to the priesthood. I've highlighted the need for a nuanced and honest assessment of our traditions. And I'm not at all in any way looking to try to modernize the church. But I do feel this is an issue of evangelization. So it's not modernization, it's evangelization and ensuring that the sacraments are accessible to as many people as possible. Now, if you disagree, let me know why and in what ways. Like I am, just like with my paintings, right? I'll be painting something, someone will like see like, dude, that eye looks funky. And sometimes I disagree with them, but sometimes they're right. And sometimes, I just need to stop thinking that I've done it correctly and just humble myself a little bit and fix it. So I invite, the sincere charitable criticism. I love it. I think it helps everyone grow. And I'd really appreciate your thoughts. Send them into, the comment section below and let me know if this type of thing interests you. And yeah, hopefully we continue this conversation more in the future. Hope you have a blessed day. And yeah, we'll catch you in the next video.